This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius, and Germanicus is here. We're by the Thames. It's a beautiful late summer evening. The water is calm. We are too, observing the 21st century, where rather than tragedy, we have comedy. Sometimes it's called farce, but comedy is the highest form of drama. It requires you to accept the fact that people are weak and enjoy themselves in any event. And the tragic error of a hero can also be the joy, the irony of the hero. Right now, we have two heroes, Cleopatra leading one team and a man with orange hair leading the other, who doesn't really describe a Roman emperor. But I asked Germanicus's opinion. Nero was a great actor, according to Nero. He won all the prizes at the Olympics in Greece. And he committed suicide very poorly. He finally had his servant help him because he thought he was going to be tortured to death by the Senate. There was no evidence that was going to happen, but he was haunted by the fact that he'd murdered his own mother, but very badly. He first built a ship that was supposed to fall apart at sea so she'd drown. She swam to shore. And then he sent poison once, twice, three times. Finally, he killed her. So he had reason to have doubts about how he would be treated by the Senate. In any event, he was a great actor, and he loved to sing and strut around the stage. And he saw himself as burdened by being the emperor. Now, that isn't Trump, but it's the closest I can come in the Julian-Claudian reign. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. What we have here are two candidates for the emperor in the year of 5 emperors who are battling memes. The Cleopatra figure is satisfied with waving to the crowd that may or may not be there. The Nero character is satisfied by doing all the talking. And it's not that the American people can't choose between them. It's that what do they get at the end of this? Is this something that happened to the Roman Empire in the 3rd century? I'm trying to guess because we know we have a couple of good centuries, 1st and 2nd, but then we fall apart. Is it because of the memes? Good evening to you.
Good evening, Gaius. Cleopatra, on the surface, because there is a mortal or immortal resemblance in a metaphorical way, it really more acutely resembles the Emperor Claudius in the Julio-Claudian line, the 4th emperor after Augustus. And she does so in the sense that she is where she is because of a caprice. I mean, she was discovered, like Claudius was, behind the curtain in the moments after the assassination of Caligula, and he was acclaimed emperor by the imperial guard. And in a sense, Ms. Harris is a person who was elevated, and in fact, it precedes her elevation to vice president, going back to her engagement as a political figure with certain important California politicians who basically introduced her to that world. I mean, this is a process that is hallowed in politics, but her sudden ascension to vice president came out of the blue. It was completely de novo. It just simply happened, and there was no basis for her elevation in terms of primary voting. She'd already dropped out. She had less than 1% of any voting, and yet she was somehow thrust into the office of vice president. Now, this isn't unusual in the course of American politics at all.
Yes, Germanicus, you remind all of us that there's never been a vote cast for Harris outside of California.
That's right. But then to be suddenly catapulted again by caprice to be the presidential candidate by a kind of backstage acclamatory process, much like you would see in the Roman Senate saying, oh, this will be our new emperor if there is, a perturbation where an emperor has died for whatever reason or been defenestrated and a new emperor is required and the Senate will acclaim a new emperor. So it has been with her, and here she is. And yet there is no element of a democratic process uh, within and among the party that defines itself as being the democracy, our democracy, just as it defined itself as the democracy in the period before 1860. The Democratic Party has elevated someone without any voting whatsoever. So this is a serendipitous situation, and yet it in no way seems to have compromised her appeal or her capacity, it seems, to win in November. And that in many ways gives the lie to the whole idea, as the Washington Post banner would have it, democracy dies in darkness. Of course, it doesn't die in darkness. It dies not only in the full light of day, but in the festive acclamation and partying atmosphere that we see today. So here you have a kind of Roman imperial succession that was well known in the 1500 years of the Roman Emperor, both the Latin Roman Empire and the Greek Roman Empire. But it's now part of the norm in the United States. And so I think her elevation marks a very powerful symbolic hinge moment, a kind of a passage in the American, procession.
Didn't Miss Harris emerge with the same approval that Mr. Trump emerged? In other words, nobody saw this coming, and it doesn't represent the past. And
Well, yeah.
and she has a campaign. Harris has a campaign that is only for show, just like Trump's campaign. It's only for show.
Well, Trump's campaign was for show, but what Trump was able to do in 2016 was take a show, meaning his engagement in WWF wrestling,
Yes.
and the understanding of what a show is as a way to engage, mobilize, and electrify the people. He turned that into a populist campaign, and he defeated fair and square some 24 opponents in 2016. He did it with incredible, éclat, success. And that made him something of an authentic figure. And his authenticity in 2016 was was translated into the tide that carried him to victory. And this time it's a bit different, and yet the authentic power of those who support him is still there, whether or not he is the same sort of electrifying figure that he was in
Well,
2016.
let's look at the Harris campaign. It consists of her coming down the steps of her aircraft, waving. That's the campaign. Now,
Yes.
that's brilliant Hollywood filmmaking. There's a very famous movie called The Big Country. You know it very well. Gregory Peck and Burl Ives,
Yeah.
Chuck. And there are scenes in there where there's no dialogue. There's just this sweeping camera following a story. That both campaigns resemble that to me these days. There's no dialogue necessary.
Right.
Everything is in the presentation.
Well, the Trump um, the Trump vision, the Trump wave, the Trump thing it is so well established now that it need not look to any kind of dialogue to ratify it or to.
Right, I agree with that. And Harris,
But the Harris thing is completely artificial.
right,
And
but isn't she doing what Trump's? I mean, it's
well,
okay.
here's the contrast, and whether the contrast is important in terms of an electoral outcome, we cannot say at this point.
Right.
And yet, Trump, whether or not he is the man he was in 2016, his campaign is still an authentic representation of the hopes and fears and dreams of a huge segment of the American electorate, while the Harris campaign is a complete souffle. It's an invented, artificial, Orwellian thing, which may succeed, but it will succeed as you have just represented. It will succeed because it is a perfect imitatio, a perfect mirror of the authenticity of Trump. And we've reached a point now where if you have the media and all the PR firms and all of the power of the establishment at your beck and call, you can successfully create a simulacrum of authenticity that will
All right.
potentially mobilize your electorate and even enough undecideds to win the election. And in line with this,
But we
just
have less than a minute. Go ahead,
in
Jim.
line with this, just as a kind of a tesserae, a kind of a little piece in a mosaic, you see all of the social media representations of the crowds at Harris rallies, and they are AI generated in order to create the impression of massive Hitler-like Nuremberg rallies. And it is remarkable how strange and yet how, you know, how not outrageous all of this is. Nobody is saying, oh, this has to be called out. It's simply part of the landscape.
I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're reflecting upon events in the 21st century. And yet, the politics are nowhere near as interesting as the wars ongoing in Eurasia, the war in Ukraine, and the war in the Middle East. We concentrate on Ukraine because something unusual to my mind. Ukraine attacked Russia. And according to the reports now, the battle goes on in the direction of Kursk, a very famous Russian city. At the same time, the Russians have not either answered adequately to drive the raiders out of Mother Russia, or they're incapable of it. I can't tell. But set that aside. That's the battlefield, fog of war. What most compels me, Germanicus, is that the governor, the restraint, the containment, the rhetoric, the hesitations, the warnings from the White House have disappeared. We had 2 years plus of the Biden administration telling Zelensky what he cannot do, just as they tell Netanyahu what he cannot do. But suddenly, and I think it's coterminous with Mr. Biden withdrawing his name from consideration for re-election, the White House has stopped at least advertising restraint. In fact, I'm told that the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Austin, is routinely on the phone with Mr. Gallant, the Minister of Defense in Israel. And the last 2.5 years are, who remembers? Was this predictable or is this surprising to you, Germanicus?
The current incursion into the territory of the Russian Federation by Ukrainian forces was entirely predictable. In fact, it was it was an essential move on the part of Ukraine. And here we have to step back for a second and look at the entirety of the Ukraine-Russian war from the standpoint of Ukrainian strategy. The entirety of Ukrainian strategy is an information strategy directed at the West, which is the source of its funding and support. And it is a strategy to garner continued Western support for the Ukrainian regime, not for Ukraine as a nation, but simply for its corrupt regime. And here, Ukraine has conducted a war entirely since the first phase, which was an authentic resistance. But every action since then, for the last 2 years, has been like a Hollywood film to create a narrative that Americans can respond to, endorse, applaud, and enthusiastically stand up as one and say, yes, here's more money for you, here's our support. And in the wake of the October 7th attack on Israel, the war in Gaza and beyond, now threatening to go wider to Galilee and elsewhere, has kind of eclipsed the attention that Americans had hitherto given to the Ukraine-Russian war. And so Ukraine has been desperate, especially recently, to try and keep itself in the American eye and to keep the heroic narrative of Ukrainian victory, imminent, inevitable Ukrainian victory, foremost in American minds. And that's been very difficult because Ukraine has suffered one setback and defeat after another. And so it continues to pursue a strategy in which any kind of traditional Clausewitzian approaches to conducting a successful campaign have been thrown overboard, because success is not about stopping or defeating Russia or bringing it to the negotiations table. It's all been about leveraging more money and support from the West. And so this incursion, you can call it an offensive, it is an incursion that was meant to seize the Western imagination, to reposition Ukraine in the Western mind as the still plucky and doughty country that has been worthy of our support all along. And unfortunately, this incursion, like others, more recently in Krinky, has met with failure. It has been stopped, it's now surrounded, and it is in the process of being dismantled. And I don't know even what useful objective might have been attained by this so-called offensive. It would only have been useful to have audaciously seized the Kursk nuclear power plant, but it didn't get close enough, and it couldn't do that. And now the full force of the Russian Federation is coming down upon it. And so it's yet another failed effort to gain our attention, to gain our sympathy, and to gain our money. And so it's part of the lamentable progress of this war, which I have never seen a country that has, and again, I'm talking about the regime, that has given over its fate by pursuing a series of fated offensives, fated initiatives and gambits that were bound always to fail, and yet initiated and pursued only in the hopes of getting more money. It's really rather, well, it's tragic.
What about the White House side of it? Remember, there used to be diktat, no more. Is that the campaign? Is that Biden? Is that a decision?
I think the U.S. has kind of cut loose from Ukraine at this point. I'm just giving you
$61 billion. I do give a fact that I gained last week that I didn't know about. apparently when the 61 billion was passed, I think in March, sometime late winter, early spring, there was an understanding that there would be a statement of the U.S. aims in Ukraine 45 days, within the next 45
Yeah,
days.
yes, there was.
We're past 100 days and there's no statement.
Well, there's no goal at this point.
But that was a promise to the Congress, which
Right,
is
right.
American
But
people.
it's like asking the Defense Department to do an audit, which
Yeah,
yeah.
they can't do. And I understand. But the
But
fact
the whole point here,
it's about Biden that there's no attention to it. Why?
I think we realize that Ukraine has shot its bolt, and we don't really care what it does at this point because it doesn't have enough to do very much. And I think all we're doing at this point is to keep Ukraine going until the election so that it doesn't collapse. And it looks like it will hold on through the election. And therefore, it's doing what it needs to do for the main party, and I use that in both senses of the word, the main party that is its support at this point.
Germanicus, Gaius, by the Thames with our cup of wine. We examined the campaign, not very vividly, because the campaigns are not vivid. They're gaudy. This would be the B-roll of news, both campaigns. That's a 20th century term, I guess. They don't do B-roll anymore, do they, Germanicus? Everything's video now.
That's right.
So B-roll used to be what you shot after you got the news that you could get in order to fill the time for the 90 seconds or a minute on television. B-roll. And Ukraine no longer interests the White House, not very much. So it won't interest the new president, whoever it is, to wave from the airplane about Ukraine. We're going to turn to one last question that will be with us long after Ukraine, long after the 24 decision, which is empire. Why is it that the successors of the Roman Empire can't get it right? The British, the French, the Venetians, the Italians, who else? The Germans several times, the Soviets, most recently the British, can't get it right. And we Romans, there are no secrets here. It's a discouraging debate now because nothing's vivid. There's nothing compelling. The campaigns are on repeat, waving. The war in Ukraine, well, America's lost interest. And empire. There's a remark made by FDR in a new book by Michel Paradis about Eisenhower, in which FDR says, if it hadn't been for and he names them, the French and the Dutch empires in the Pacific, we wouldn't be in a war out there. FDR disdained empires. The Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, the three that were coterminous and had cut up most of Asia. However, we have an American empire now that's following the same course of dissolution and disappointment that those previous empires followed. So what is it that the Romans did that we Romans did right that our successor empires or the wannabe successors can't get right? Is there a single answer, Germanicus, or is this something that is particular to each case, so there's no one answer?
It's a sort of multi-layered answer in the sense that it's an apples and oranges comparison. The Roman Empire was a universalist empire that dominated the ecumene, the known world, whereas all of the successor empires from Charlemagne, Napoleon, Spanish, British, Dutch, you name it, they were much smaller propositions, and they all suffered rather quickly in the course of a century or a century and a half from overreach combined with the rise of rivals that put them in a position where they could no longer command whatever advantages had originally given them the room and space and opportunity to live large, right? Now, the US is different because the US does in some way appear to resemble ancient Rome, our Rome, in the sense the US has had the opportunity to propose and to fulfill, to an extent, to fill in at least, the simulacrum of a universal empire. And what is important here, if we are to compare this sort of US world empire, or at least global hegemony that we have tried to maintain since 1991, is the fact that if you were to look at Rome, the moments when Rome was most at risk of coming apart, where it was put in a position that was most disadvantageous, that led to calamity and defeat, those would be periods mostly where Rome had a succession of weak emperors. I mean, one of those periods was in the 3rd century. I mean, if you look at the emperors then, Gaius, Messius, Quintus, Trajanus, Decius, killed, by the way, in north of the Danube, Gaius Vibius, Trebianus, Gallus, Marcus Emilianus, Publius Lucinus Valerianus, and Valerian, of course, was captured by the Sasanian Persians and then later killed.
You remind me of the lessons I skipped in school. None of these characters they're not even answers on multiple choice questions for Roman children.
No, but they should be, because they all reigned only 2 or 3 years each. They all met pretty bad ends, and they were unable to stop the dissolution of the Roman Empire, which, by the way, which is another thing we're not taught, fell in the 3rd century and then had to be put back together by several really strong emperors, starting with Aurelian, followed by Diocletian, and then Constantine. And this is repeated again in Byzantium in the 11th century, where you have a really not very nice empress, Zoe, who murdered several of her consorts in a row, followed by Constantine X Ducas, who let everything go to hell, and then finally Michael VII, and then Nikephoros III Botanietes, who just let everything fall apart. And this is the problem that we face in the US today, is that we've had, starting with, and I'll just say it, Mr. Biden, but all bets are on that if the next empress is Ms. Harris, you cannot survive several weak rulers. Several weak emperors will lead to disaster. And the truth is, and this is something, again, that needs to be said, and no one will say it, is that the US in the last 4 years is chasing catastrophe, not minor little inconvenient defeats that can be covered over with imperial overhead, like defeats in Afghanistan and in Iraq.
We
No,
have a minute, Germanicus.
this is the defeat that we're facing now is one that poses the loss of confidence in the dissolution of the American empire as it stands today. And so 2 or 3 such weak emperors over the space even of 12 years will mean a completely changed landscape in which the US is a shrunken power.
The might of Rome, simple formula, but it cannot withstand weak leadership. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos, Gaius. I'm John Batchelor. We're on to the theater. We don't know what the bill is tonight. It might be music. If we're lucky, it's music. It doesn't matter. We enjoy ourselves. It's a beautiful summer evening. Of course, we sacrifice to the great god Augustus. That's why we're sitting here at the edge of the empire, secure, safe, and not having to work, because the Greeks do it for us. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor.